Before I start this message, I'm going to ask you to forgive me in advance for two things. I'm going to go a little longer than my 20-minute target. I'm going to go by maybe 5 minutes longer, or less, depending on how fast I can talk. And I'm also going to get a little academic. I'm sorry. I need to go this route a little bit because I'm hoping that by the end of it, I will have illuminated something that's pretty special about Pivot 613. So, a shift has been happening around the world. And it's been happening for some time now, and it's more obvious in certain parts of the world than it is in others. The Industrial Revolution, the proliferation of education, the advancement of science, and things like that ushered in a period in our history that some people have called modernism. Now, if you've studied anything about social or societal change, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Modernism at its core asserts that reason and science provide an accurate, objective, reliable foundation for knowledge. And so as the direct results, the systems on which our world has been built were formed through modernism. These are systems that prioritize science and rational thought. And so they've given birth to industrialization, secularization, public education, and even socialism and capitalism. Now, many academics have theorized that modernism or modernity started in the late 1800s and it picked up steam through the last century as human innovation and science and knowledge experienced an unprecedented explosion. And to this day, there is so much about our world that we experience that modernism gave us. Many of us, myself included, still hold rational, logical, and systematic thinking in high regard. Many of us still look to the advances of science and scientific method to answers to almost every question that we have about our past or our future. We are still highly individualistic, and all over the world there is an increasing push towards individual rights, personal freedoms, and equality. These are things that modernism has given us. Now, over the years, starting especially after the Second World War, and like each world sort of cataclysm kind of accelerates this forward, questions started to form about the absolutes of modernism. Not every problem can be dissected or solved with rational, logical thinking. Not every solution can be found through scientific method. Not everyone finds their purpose and meaning in individual pursuit. As much as modernism was doing so much good in the world in accelerating progress, it was an incomplete paradigm for the world. And since that time, these questions have set root in the hearts of people around the world. You can see flashes of it all throughout our recent history as alternative movements have flamed in and flamed out. You know, the sexual revolutions and the hippie movements of the 60s and 70s and early 80s challenged the acceleration towards individualism and nuclear families and reintroduced the concepts of interconnectedness and community. Environmental activism has a very postmodern aspect to it because it is in part a rejection of relentless development that completely destroys the environment. Even more recently, you could see it expressed in movements like Occupy. Occupy flamed in and flamed out spectacularly. But they were trying to shine a light on the vices and excesses of capitalism. Now, most of you have lived through this change and have been changed by it, but never realized it. Most people you talk to today do not 100% possess the rigidity that modernity prescribes. Most people understand that the path to all the solutions in life is not always reason and logic and science because people are not always reasonable or logical. Isn't that the truth? And so our world has been changing. The kind of conversations that we're having in politics and communities and coffee shops and universities and elementary schools and high schools are completely different than they used to be. Instead of absolutes, we speak in relative terms. Gender and sexuality, for example, is not expressed simply in binary terms, but is instead expressed as a spectrum. There is not one universal truth, but instead there are many judgments of what truth might be based on individual or cultural experience or exposure. Our world has been shifting for many years now. Education, reason, and logic have answered many questions, but they've also created many, many more questions. And this has given rise to the shift that I'm referring to, the shift away from modernism to postmodernism. This shift has happened faster in some countries than in others. For example, Canada is a much more postmodern country than the United States. Western Europe, especially the Scandinavian countries, are far more postmodern than other industrialized countries around the world. So, okay, Paulo, before I tune you out and I start flipping through Snapchat, what does this have to do with the world, and what does this have to do with a church and a gathering of people on a Sunday afternoon? Well, I'm glad you asked. Something happened in the church during the time of modernism that was quite unexpected. We took the same things that modernism espoused, and we applied them to matters of faith. You see, the church was not founded by educated, rational, logical, scientific people. Most of them were illiterate, and their faith survived through stories and the experiences of God that they had as the communities that followed the teachings of Christ. Now, unfortunately, the well-educated people and the well-read leaders of the church, after the first few glorious years of the church's birth, used their privilege as a way to manipulate their illiterate followers. And as a result, the church went through several centuries of some really dark and disgusting stuff. But with the rise of education, it gave birth to modernism, and the church was able to reform itself through more and more people getting educated and learning to read. There were early reformers like Martin Luther, John Calvin, later John Wesley and Charles Spurgeon and D.L. Moody and others. And these men and women helped to form the basis of the church over a few hundred years up to the turn of the century. These men and women, they put forth such strong arguments about the reformation of the faith that in a few hundred years, and especially at the turn of the century, it really accelerated, and the church was able to turn away from its past of oppression and take on a completely reformed image. The church went from being an oppressor of people to being an emancipator. The church went from manipulating the illiteracy of masses to establishing institutions of education around the world. The church went from peddling false hope and fraudulent miracles and established hospitals in every corner of the world. The church has started more hospitals than anybody else. The transformation under the guidance of these reformers and led by their thoughts is pretty astonishing. The power of their reasoning and logic was so strong that in an emerging world where reason and logic were of such high value, there was a great awakening of faith in the world. And so you will see that at the start of the century, right up to about the 50s and 60s, there was an unprecedented explosion of Christians around the world like never before. I find it hilarious that people who try to debunk faith movements such as Christianity miss the obvious influences of science in the church today. Now, we all know there are quack preachers who peddle nothing but hope and fraudulent miracles and emotional suggestion. We all know they exist. But they are a small portion of the people that lead the church. What people do not know is that, for example, in the Catholic Church, you cannot just say you performed a miracle. You can't. There has to be a scientific study commissioned by the Vatican. It has to go through several committees before it gets approved as actually being a miracle. Mother Teresa, who was just sainted last weekend, has 2 miracles to her name. We all know quack preachers who have like 6,000 miracles behind them. Most of those miracles would not survive the Catholic Church process of determining whether it is a miracle or not. Like, they use science to determine whether it was a miracle or not. The Bible is one of the most accurately translated passages of literature because there is such a rigorous linguistic process of verification of both the original documents and the translations. You can't just put out a translation of the Bible. The majority of pastors and bishops in the church have been rigorously tested before their ordination. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but you get my point. The church, formed in the era of modernity, has become this serious institution that uses science and rational thought and logic. And we use these things in part as a way to provide an accurate, objective foundation for knowledge. In fact, that's why most sermons sound like university lectures. When you hear words like absolute truth, when you hear the church spoken about in systematic, logical terms, you can understand why. Modernism has influenced the church. But the problem is that culture has not remained static. Culture has shifted. Modernism gave birth to postmodernism. The culture is changing. And with a changing culture comes a changing conversation. And so in this new emerging world that we're a part of, where long-held beliefs are being eroded by deconstructionist and relativistic thinking, the church has to change the way that it speaks to this new emerging world. But unfortunately, the church has not been very good at taking this corner. I wanted to let you in on a little secret. I'm all about spilling the secrets of pastors. I've sat through many more pastors' gatherings than I would ever want any of you to attend. And the one thing that I've seen more than anything else is that many of my colleagues are at a loss of how to adapt their congregations and their leaders to the changes that have already happened in our country. Postmodernism is here. It has changed the conversation. And while the church continues to talk, communities have tuned us out, just like some of you have tuned me out this afternoon. Last week, we talked about how the reaction of fear can create one reality, and the reaction of love can create a completely separate reality. And I've been in many conversations about this issue, about how we live in a postmodern, post-Christian Canada. And most of these conversations that I've had with leaders are laced with fear and trepidation because the future is unknown. And these changes have gutted congregations around the country. The conversations tend to be fear conversations. But when we realized that we could write a different future if we chose to respond with love, all of a sudden something switched in the minds of the people that chose to come and start Pivot 613. By choosing love over fear, we started to see how postmodernism is not a threat, but it is an opportunity that God has given us to replant the gospel in our communities. But in order to do this, there were many things that had to change about our approach. For example, we had to approach the culture with the understanding that for most people, truth is not absolute. It is relative. Now, in the churches and the cultures from which we've emerged, this suggestion is preposterous. But shouting at the emerged culture only makes people shut down. If people realize that you're not willing to give their version of the truth credence, they're not willing to have a conversation with you about your version of it. We had to realize that we have to approach culture understanding that the emerged and still emerging view of, let's say, gender and sexuality is that it is fluid. Now, in churches where we've upheld monogamy and celibacy and traditional marriage, this is a tough conversation to have. And to be honest, the church is terrible at having this conversation, aren't we? Now, these are only two examples, but I hope you can see how much it really started to explode our heads when we started thinking about all the things we would have to reimagine in order to do things differently than the way that we've done them in the past. But this time, instead of running the other direction with fear, we chose the path of love and chose to move towards it. We started to see all the people that we could reach with the message of grace if we change our methods. Now, if you've ever tried to change a company or an organization, you know how difficult it is. It is practically impossible to take people that have long-held traditions and ways of doing things and flip them on their heads. People freak out. There's a lot of shouting and back-channeling and backstabbing and resignations and on. And most times what ends up happening is that instead of sticking to the changes, because things are hard, organizations just return to the way things used to be. So we looked at our congregations that we were a part of and realized that as much as we loved them, if we were to implement any of the new ideas we had, it would have disastrous consequences. In order to fully engage in the ways that we thought we could with the new conversations about life and spirituality and purpose and family and salvation in a postmodern era, we had to get out of having one foot stuck in the past. We needed a new vessel to implement this new way of thinking. When Jesus walked this earth and he started his new movement, it caused so much chaos within the established religious order of the time. He upset the established order of doing things over and over again. He turned his back on the religious elite. He called them some pretty interesting names. He poked holes in long-held traditions. He drove them nuts. It drove people nuts. And one day, they had had enough. And they confronted Jesus about it. Let's read it together. Matthew 9. Later, when Jesus was eating supper at Matthew's house with his close followers, a lot of disreputable characters came and joined them. I like that. Disreputable characters. When the Pharisees saw him keeping this kind of company, they had a fit and they let into Jesus' followers. What kind of example is this from your teacher acting cozy with crooks and riffraff? Jesus, overhearing, shot back, who needs a doctor? The healthy or the sick? Go figure out what this scripture means. I'm after mercy, not religion. I'm here to invite outsiders, not coddle insiders. A little later, John's followers approached asking, why is it that we and the Pharisees rigorously discipline body and spirit by fasting, but your followers don't? Wow, someone's losing it out there. Jesus told them, when you're celebrating a wedding, you don't skimp on the cake and wine, you feast. Later, you may need to pull in your belt, but not now. No one throws cold water on a friendly bonfire. This is kingdom come. He went on, no one cuts up a fine silk scarf to patch old work clothes. You want fabrics that match. And you don't pour your wine in cracked bottles. Jesus was so far outside the box that it just blew their minds. To Jesus, it was simple. Go to the people that are most broken because they're the ones most in need of help. And looking at it from our 2,000-year perspective, it seems obvious. But to the people in Jesus' time, there was something wrong with these broken people. They were riffraff, they were crooks, they were Roman sympathizers. Jesus, what are you doing with crooks and riffraff? Why are you trampling over our traditions of fasting? What are you doing, Jesus? And Jesus sums it up so smartly. You can't understand what I'm doing if you try to stuff it into the old way of doing things. No one cuts up a fine silk scarf to patch up old work clothes. You want fabrics that match. And you don't put new wine into cracked bottles. Other versions of the scripture say you don't put new wine into old wineskins because the wineskins will burst. Hashtag mind blown. This is why we started Pivot 613. This is our 2020. We realize that all around us the world is changing. The conversation is changing. And the ways that we need to speak to this culture have to be adjusted. If the message of grace and love that we looked at last week is so transformative, we have to reimagine the ways to plant it back into the culture in which we're situated. The fact of the matter is that individuals, schools, communities, and even churches could be changed with the message of Christ's grace. And no matter a person's persuasion about life, the relativity of truth, or any other fluid postmodern concept, we believe that there is something so good about knowing God and about having His love permeate you and fill your life with light. At Pivot 613, we do it in subtle ways. For example, I never preach from the premise that everybody agrees with me. In fact, if you've been here, you'll know that in a few minutes I'll be asking you to interact with the message, and if you disagree, please say so. We don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to anything at Pivot. Now, for the churchy church people who try and investigate Pivot and go, hey, what are your nuts and bolts things? It drives them a little bit nuts because we don't have a one-size-all-fits approach. Our emerging Canada is culturally diverse. That's why when I lead, I don't just lead one genre of music. If you come in here, you may find gospel playing or rap or a cappella. We do this because this is the world in which we live. If you look on people's iPhones, there's not just one genre of music on their iPhones, is there? Why would we have a church then where there's one genre of music or one cultural expression to the exclusion of all others? That does not make sense. If you look at the things on our website about the church that we've said we want to build, we talk about a culturally diverse, multi-generational, theologically diverse church. And why? Because we think that if we do these things, we will be a church that is most effective in the postmodern era in which we live. And we've been called to build something that understands this new reality in which we are, instead of fighting it. This is why I'm a transparent leader. It is because emerging generations have the best BS meters of anybody. I cannot pretend to be anything that I'm not. I used to be a pastor that put on a pastor suit and went to work. And the people at that church thought that they knew me, but they didn't. That's what we were told as pastors. Don't let them know everything. I don't know why that thinking still exists. But emerging generations can see right through that. In fact, most of you can. You know when someone's being genuine and when they're not. So I stopped pretending. We're not trying to build a pristine church where everyone looks perfect and everything looks perfectly put together, because our world knows that the projection of perfection is a fallacy. People value authenticity, and if we're to have a chance of sharing Christ with anybody, we have to be authentic. Another thing that we've done here is I have publicly stated that anybody of any sexual orientation and gender identity is welcome here. I'm not interested in the fight over these issues because I'm concerned about something much more important. I want everybody to find the perfect love that casts out all fear. We talked about this last week. I really want everybody to meet Jesus as I have. I hope that you do too. Pivot 613 was started because you can't just jam these things into any congregation. Some of my pastor colleagues think I'm nuts. They do. And I've been told from the very beginning, it's never going to work. But I couldn't shake this 2020. I couldn't shake it when we saw it 3 or 4 years ago when we started talking about the possibility of starting a church. We looked around and our hearts were filled with compassion and love for people. And then we looked at the containers that we had and the structures that we're a part of and realized that if we wanted to have a conversation with an emerging postmodern culture, we had to sadly walk away from these containers and these structures. We couldn't sew different fabrics together. We couldn't put new wine into cracked bottles. We had to start something new, and this something new is Pivot 613. Now, is it perfect? No. Do we have all the answers? No. But what we have, I think, is a clear vision of grace. And what we have been convinced of is that we need to re-engage with the change that is happening all around us by reimagining everything that we can about the church. We feel that we've been called in the way of Jesus, to break with long-held traditions, to reach people that desperately need him. And so I'm going to end with this. I invite you, anyone that listens to this message online, consider your part in this. Allow God to light up your mind with possibility where this is concerned. And don't choose the path of fear. Choose love. Let God's love illuminate your place in this emerging story. Amen. That's all I have to say.